Hey everyone, good morning. Happy Wednesday. I am here for our weekly Ask a Recruiter session, and today I am joined with Carleen. And today, Carleen is going to walk us through some common interview questions. This should be really great, super helpful for preparing for all of your upcoming interviews. If you have questions, please leave them in the chat. And as always, if you are interested in joining us in our free Slack community, we will leave the link below where you can find Carleen, the team from Recruitomics Consulting, myself, and a whole bunch of really awesome people who are in there answering questions and talking about all things job hunting related. So, Carleen, you want to take it over?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that intro. As always, Alison and I always enjoy, jumping on these calls with you on our Wednesday mornings. And it's great to, figure out different ways that we can help all candidates, especially throughout, the whole lifespan of the job hunting process. And so today, I'm really glad that we're doing this week because last week, Karina, did a session with candidates regarding developing elevator pitches. Once you're launching into doing an interview and fielding some of these interview questions that I'm about to talk about, it's really great to start at the front with a really great, elevator pitch that you've prepared for, either literally encountering someone who might have a job opportunity for you, in person at a conference, but you can also use it, to kind of be the introduction for your interview as well. And so, it's really important to prepare for an interview. I think a lot of people might get a little bit too comfortable with their pitch, like they've done a few interviews or they've done interviews in the past, or maybe they've recently had to do some type of talk or presentation. And so they feel like, they're able to just kind of go into it. But, you have to remember that every situation is different. Every interviewer is different. Every organization is different. So you really have to do your homework to, get acquainted with that organization and really take an audit of your experience as well. And so, and this whole process is really helpful too because it's going to automatically boost your confidence in terms of what you're looking for, but also in terms of your experience, right? And so, also being familiar with common questions can also enhance your performance in terms of actually delivering the interview, but also really help you, think about the things that you're most competent at. And so, like I mentioned, doing that self-assessment. And so I think the question that trips people up the most is often the first question and seems like it should be the easiest question, but, can be really difficult because, where do you start? The tell me about yourself question. And I think it's also the question that people dread the most often. This has many different functions for the person doing the interview. It gauges your ability to communicate and also assess your relevant experiences. Whether or not you're able to do, a short 2 to 3 minute elevator pitch, and also being able to assess whether or not you're able to make your answer more general and accessible to other people, who might be in your organization or maybe you're customer facing or patient facing, and also highlighting your background and strengths and how they relate specifically to the job. And so, in terms of communication, candidates often, might look really great on paper, but might not be able to go into, different projects that they've worked on in the past, or, as it mentions at the bottom, how it relates to the job itself. There are things between submitting your application and doing the interview, you might realize, hey, like I talked about doing this specific type of skill, but I never talked about how it's really relevant to this job specifically. And, also making sure that you're able to calibrate your background and, the types of projects that you've worked with, depending on the person that you're speaking with and what their background might be, right? Whether or not you're talking to someone who is in your field or maybe even a leader in your field, you might not want to do an introduction, like a one-on-one in their field. Or maybe someone is, a complete beginner in your field and you need to do like a really, foundational explanation of what your work is. And I think, weirdly enough, this is another question that can kind of trip people up sometimes. What is your greatest strength? I've talked to some candidates recently who, had really great experience and were super qualified for the position, and their values lined up with the organization very well. and they just had a really difficult time talking about themselves. When we talked about them reviewing what their greatest strengths were, they had almost this ingrained feeling that when you talked about your greatest strengths that you were being arrogant. And so we did some coaching to talk about, hey, when you talk about your greatest strength, instead of talking about how, oh, I'm great at X, Y, and Z, you can talk about like how you grew to develop that strength, and really focusing on a strength that's most relevant to the role. And so it's also super helpful during these interviews, whether if you can provide an actual example of how you've demonstrated this strength, especially if it aligns really closely with the job description, and emphasizing how it benefits both you and the company, right? So making sure that you're talking about something that you really love doing, but also demonstrate that you know that there's a lot of room to grow, and that this company specifically can help you further develop that skill set, and maybe even how that opportunity isn't available elsewhere. What is your greatest weakness can also be a really tough one, right? Oftentimes people are inclined to say, oh, like maybe they don't have a weakness, and I think that also can be a difficult thing to navigate when a reference is citing something for you. But yeah, it's really important to cite a weakness that you've actively worked to improve. I think a one that I came across a lot, especially in academia, is asking for help. I feel like in certain fields, especially if you're in science, it can be really difficult to get away from being that person who's always really independent. I'm going to look up all the protocols. I'm going to look up all the papers that I can find online and try to solve this problem myself. So something that you've been working on for a long time is knowing when to ask for help. So that's an example of a type of weakness that you can very easily, transition to examples where you've been able to work on that. And it also highlights your transferable skills, right? Are there other things that you've worked on that have helped you develop, this weakness, and improve your skill set within that field? And it also showcases your commitment to both professional and personal development. The fact that you're able to even identify a weakness is in and of itself a strength. And maybe you even want to talk about how that weakness has carried over into other parts of your life, and how lessons outside of work have guided you in addressing those weaknesses and finding ways to address them in interesting and unique ways. Why do you want to work here? Surprisingly enough, I have talked to a few candidates who, haven't done any research on the company and really aren't sure how, their background aligns well with the company, and that is a huge red flag. And sometimes you can make it past the recruiting call, but certainly once you talk to the hiring manager, they're really going to drill into, why you're interested in the company, and whether or not you've even just done your research, right? And you being able to articulate with great detail how your values line up with the company's values, and missions in terms of your career goals, especially if you're transitioning from a different field or a different kind of position. They really want to get a good understanding of strategically what your big picture mission or strategies have been, in terms of actively working on your career. Telling a challenging situation that you've had to face previously. And I think, it's very popular nowadays for people to talk about using the STAR method. So this is, lining up, the situation in terms of outlining the situation, the task at hand, what type of action you executed, and what that result was. And in using this method, just like with your resume, it's really helpful here if you're able to use any type of metrics, right? So whether or not the situation is, we didn't have these certain kinds of KPIs, we weren't able to recruit a certain number of patients, we weren't able to accomplish a certain number of sales, and what your task was within that situation. Were you the more junior person in this role, and you were doing a little bit of managing up to provide some suggestions in improving the situation, or maybe you were actually someone who was in the more senior role, and your task for this big picture problem was actually trying to figure out how to delegate solutions. And what that action was the specific methods that you've used and the results, right? Were you actually able to, improve those numbers in terms of KPIs and sales and clients and things like that? And make sure that the type of situation that you pick out is relevant to the current job, right? So, and in some ways, maybe you could talk about something that is a little bit divergent from the current role, but maybe you can highlight ways in which those solutions were actually transferable and demonstrate your ability to, use a lot of creativity and, meld different fields. And highlight your problem solving and teamwork skills, right? Maybe there was a logistical problem that you were trying to solve, but maybe there was also an interpersonal problem that actually was the origin of the problem, or maybe was slowing down your ability to develop that solution. So that's a really great way to kind of layer or introduce many different layers or aspects of your skill set, all within one story. And where do you see yourself in 5 years? I think this is another one. This is another one that makes a lot of candidates cringe because it seems just kind of so cliche, and it can really, force you into a deer in the headlight situation. But it's helpful to understand that when an interviewer is asking this question, it's because they're trying to imagine how your career development fits with the rest of the team, right? So, for example, you might not know that the interviewer is actually planning on retiring soon, or maybe they're planning on moving up into a higher position soon. And, maybe you're currently interviewing for an entry level position, but they're looking for someone to train to eventually take over their position in 3 or 5 years, right? And they want to make sure that your goals align well with that. In terms of your personal growth, maybe they know that they're about to hire 5, 10 more people in the next like 6 months to a year, and they want to know whether or not you would be interested or motivated into being that kind of person who would train other people on the team. And also, you might not know at the time what the long-term growth trajectory of the company overall is, whether or not the company is looking to acquire other organizations, and where your interests might lie with those long-term plans as well. And it also emphasizes your commitment to learning and contributing, right? If they're going to hire you, they're not necessarily looking for someone who's going to leave in the next year. They want someone who, is motivated and interested in how the company is evolving and how your personal contributions apply in terms of that, especially when you're considering startup companies, right? A lot of our candidates are really interested in working with startup companies because they love that opportunity to be, at the ground level, and seeing a ton of growth versus, if you're working at an organization that's more established, you might not have those same opportunities. So why did you leave your previous job? That can be another sticky question too, as well. Of course, you never want to make any type of negative remarks about your previous organization, especially, your previous supervisor, even though that may be and often is, your main motivator for looking at other positions. But one of the main things you can do is just emphasize that you're seeking new challenges, growth. A lot of our candidates, when we speak to them, many times they've, experienced stagnation in their current position. Maybe they are that kind of person who eventually wants to be involved in leadership and wants to contribute to developing new and innovative tools. But the current team they're in, kind of wants them to do the same thing over and over again. And, they're not really looking to grow. So, they don't have any opportunities in the future to have direct reports. So, these are really great responses that aren't red flags at all and are like very common reasons for people to be looking for their next job. Another really common reason why people are looking for new positions is, hey, is there a lot of instability in your current position? Is there a recent acquisition that's not going really well? Is your company suffering from, changes or, in terms of their funding and things like that? And, of course, it's always totally legitimate to just want to expand your skill set. Maybe you've been working in the same field for the past 5 years and you just want to make sure that you diversify your skill set because you know that your field changes so often and you want to stay relevant. So, even if there are difficulties in your current position, if you think deeply about your career development and what's important to you, I guarantee that you'll find something in terms of growth that are relevant to your situation. And do you have any questions for us? I'm always surprised when candidates don't have questions for us. Um, the initial impression that I get when a candidate doesn't have a question is that they don't know much about the company. Because I feel like if you really do your research in terms of the company, you'll always come across something like, huh, like that's a really interesting project that they're working on. I wonder, what the origin of that was or where they're going with it. If you really do your research, you might see, oh, hey, they have a new CEO, or hey, like they just announced that they're working on this new, treatment or product. And I'm really interested in learning more about, what team is working with that. And of course, there's lots of logistical questions that you should be asking. How big is my team? What should my day to day be like? What type of strategies does your potential supervisor use in terms of mentorship? There are lots of general questions that you should be asking for every role that you're interviewing with. But I also think that coming up with questions that are more specific to the role and the company that you're interviewing with are not only very important, they can usually be more fun, right? Demonstrating that you have done your homework, especially I always talk more about academia because that's so much of my background. I always tell students, if you're interviewing with a new lab or you're interviewing with a new company, if you could find, hopefully they give you the name of the person you're interviewing with, look them up. What have they worked on? Do they have a career trajectory that you're really interested in? For example, if they were in the same space that you currently are in, 10 years ago, great. Now you have a career path that you may have never heard of before. And you're like, wow, like I didn't know that you could go from A to Z. And now I have questions about, oh, when you were, a student like me, or when you were, a junior salesperson like me, how did you, go about making the decisions that in terms of the transitions that you've made over your career. And of course everybody loves talking about themselves, and when you ask an interviewer about those kinds of things, they light up, they have a lot more fun, and it makes the whole interview experience much more of a conversation and less of an assessment, less of an exam per se. So remember that your interviewer is a person too. They're looking for someone that they'll enjoy working with and that they'll be able to grow as a leader with also. So keep it dynamic and just constantly be curious. But yeah, well, that's everything I had for today. And we'd be happy to take any more questions and just to discuss further with Allison.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carleen. That was excellent as always. We only have a few questions unless some come in while we're doing this. But one of the questions that we got in advance was, what happens if you just blank? Like if they ask you a question, you're like, I know the answer and it's buried and you can't think of anything to say, or you say sort of the roundabout thing. Is it okay to follow up with an interviewer after and say, I thought more about your question? And
Oh yeah, 100%. I think one thing that you can do prior to your interview is practicing pausing. So if you think more from like a preventative perspective first, and then we can talk about like what you can do in the moment. Um, you will always look more thoughtful if you pause. And I think, having that as a strategic habit, and it really demonstrates that you are a thoughtful person. You're not just, doing that roundabout thing. You're not just making something up on the spot. And so, of course, you don't want to wait too long, because that can get kind of awkward. But you can always pull out that is a really great question. Let me think about that for a second. And maybe you don't have the answer, but I'm sure it will remind you of something that you do have the answer for. And if you don't know the answer, you can be upfront with that. You can say, I don't know the answer to that exact question, but I do know that X, Y, and Z. But I'd love to follow up with you about that and do a little bit more research and think about whether or not, there's something in the past that I have worked on. And, in the moment, I just haven't been able to think of it right now. Everybody blanks. everybody, has worked on something that they totally forgot that they did. And following up, if anything, is a really great excuse to follow up.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. It kind of gives you the way to ease into a follow-up email as well. Um, to your point though, that everyone forgets things they've worked on and maybe they forget the questions that they actually really, really need to know and want to know. How do you feel about people coming into interviews? I guess this is specific to in-person interviews with notes.
Oh yeah, love it. It shows that you're prepared. I always think it's weird when people, at least specifically in person, show up without notes. Because I'm the kind of person who like constantly walks around with a notebook. Um, but yeah, and if you're, my husband has a perfect memory, so I know that he can get away with it. But having those notes, especially if you end up being the kind of person who like meanders a little bit, and you realize, oh man, I'm running out of time. I think, in terms of if you're doing a virtual interview, you can, have your multiple monitors, you can, have your electronic notes set up on the side. And if you're the type of person who, you really benefit from having that, tactile experience, tape it to your monitor, have, your cute notepad on the side. And because you'll find that sometimes you'll end up getting into the really nitty gritty technical questions, and then you'll forget to ask, oh, how big is the team? Or like, how often, will I meet with my supervisor? So I would say always have notes, because you never know if you'll blank, or if you'll run out of time, or if you end up just getting, spending 20 minutes on one question.
And I think it goes back to also looking prepared. You've come in
Mhm.
with some thoughts on paper. You've clearly haven't just kind of rolled in and thought, "Oh, I'll just do this on the
Mhm.
fly." So
Yeah,
I agree. I personally am a big note taker. I always go in with notes for everything. And I think an interview is no different. Probably the most important time to have reference materials, including your own CV. I've always
oh
found it's
yeah.
really helpful to have my own resume and stuff to refer back to
Mhm.
because sometimes you
Oh,
forget what's
I
on
agree.
there.
Yeah. And then also another reason why I think it's important to have notes, and also not just like a small notepad, like I would take notes when the interviewer is answering my questions, right? There are a million different, logistical things and lots of, big picture strategy things that you'll want to remember afterwards. Like basic things like, when should I hear back? I feel like regardless of whether or not the interview goes really well, and, you know, you talk about a million different things, like afterwards, like there's so much information you might not retain it. So really helpful to write those things down. And that is another thing that indicates your interest, is if you're, actually writing down what they're saying.
Yeah, and I think, like you said too, this is an interview for the company as well. They're interviewing you and you're interviewing them. So make sure you do have the questions that you want the answers to
Mhm.
because if you commit to going, you're probably there for a while and you want to enjoy it and you want to make sure it's a good place for you as well. So it's a great opportunity to bring those questions and get them answered.
Yeah,
So
for sure. And I have seen notes, from when people have done hiring manager interviews, and especially team interviews. I've seen, multiple people from a team will be like, "This person had no questions," and they'll cut them based off of that. And yeah, and this is great too because we actually have a previous session where we did talk about questions to ask your interviewer. So if you haven't seen that one yet, I suggest following up with it. I think it'll be really helpful when you're navigating this process.
yeah, and I have one last one, and this goes back to when you are the person answering the questions. I think we've all heard stories about the interviewers who kind of throw a total curveball at people, like, "What type of tree would you be?" If you are in that position and you get some really off the wall question, do you have any strategies for how people can just gracefully sort of take a breath and back up, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, for sure. I think you can, institute the same strategy I mentioned before, with pausing and acknowledging the question, and, really saying, wow, like I've never thought about that before. And, I think that is one situation where you could kind of, talk through your thought process. Oh, yeah, in terms of plants, that really does remind me of, when I think of people, I'm surprised that I actually could label other people with these, plants. And, my mom reminds me of X, and my coworker reminds me of Y. So, when I think about that, I think I'm, this type of plant. and illustrating. When they ask you that type of question, they don't expect you to have thought about. If anything, they're asking that question because they know that you've never heard it before. I think a common consulting question is, how many golf balls would fit in like this specific type of jet, like airplane. And so the reason why they're asking that question is because they want to know your thought process. So show them.
Yep. Absolutely. We did just have a question come in. It's not entirely about interview questions, but Carleen, if you're game for it, I'll throw it out there for you.
For sure.
Um, Once you apply for a position, how long should you wait before following up with the job poster for that position about any updates? Ooh, that's a good question.
I think people have different opinions about this. For me personally, I think a week, between any type of correspondence. So job post, 1 week, talk to the recruiter, don't hear anything back, 1 week, interview with the hiring manager, waiting another week. Um, I think, there is a time frame. There is a too frequent and there is a too late, right? If you ask, 2 days later and then another 3 days later, they might not have any information for you. And, I don't think they would necessarily automatically be frustrated with you, but, at some point it has diminishing returns. I think if you wait 3 weeks, that's definitely too late. Because, they might have started interviewing a ton more people. And I think for some groups, it does indicate that you're not interested. Like they literally will just be like, oh, they never followed up. They must not be interested. So sending those thank you notes, sending those follow-up emails for updates, I think is really important. And I know it can be so hard to wait a full week, but you just kind of have to do it. I feel like that's the industry standard, is to wait a week. But I love that you're thinking about following up for an application, especially if it's a job where there might be 200 applications. There's nothing wrong with reaching out to the recruiter. A lot of job posts these days have the actual recruiter or like talent acquisition head there. Add them, send them a message on LinkedIn, and just get them to put you on the radar.
And it is a really good time to ask the question, how quickly are you moving with this role? And kind of gauge their timeline as well. If you know they're under a really tight time crunch, then maybe you do expect to hear back a little bit sooner. If they're sort of testing the waters, could be longer. So I think that circles back to when you do have the opportunity to talk to someone, make sure you ask that question about their timeline for filling the role.
Yeah, that's a great question, especially since, sometimes, they say, oh, I want to fill the role yesterday, and they're going to move things quickly. But sometimes, they're like, we'd be happy to fill this role within the next 3 months. So they really aren't hustling to get you through interviews quickly. And, that has a lot of implications in terms of your job search, right? Are you looking for something because you need, take care of your family right now and, you're thinking about long-term trajectories, or are you looking for the perfect job and you're willing to wait out for a while?
Yep. That's a really, really good point. Well, Carleen, thank you as always. It's always a delight. These are such a great start to the Wednesday. I look forward to seeing everyone in the Slack room. We will drop the link, as I mentioned earlier, right under all of our social media channels under this chat. And we'll be back here next week for our next Ask the Recruiter. If you have any questions in the meantime, please let us know. We are always happy to answer them. Carleen, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks everyone for your time. See you in the Slack channel.
Bye.